The silence of the room was a living thing, heavy with the weight of everything that hadn't happened. She had spent years sharpening her mind into a blade, anticipating a monster who would try to crush her spirit, yet Orion had defeated her with nothing more than indifference. It was a calculated cruelty she hadn't rehearsed for. Astraea moved away from the glass, her bare feet silent on the cold marble, feeling the ridiculousness of her lace-trimmed edges. She wasn't a bride. She was a political ghost haunting a kingdom that feared her husband's shadow more than his touch. Every instinct told her to flee, but the memory of Titus's oily smile reminded her there was nowhere left to go. She was trapped between a stepfather who had discarded her and a king who refused to see her. Tomorrow, the court would whisper about the lack of a blood-stained sheet, and Archon would begin his descent like a vulture. She had to find the man behind the general, even if his fractured wolf was the very thing that would eventually devour her whole. Astraea pulled the sheer silk tighter around her shoulders, though it offered no warmth against the draft sweeping through the cavernous room. Every shadow in the corner seemed to morph into the silhouette of a man who had deemed her unworthy of even a greeting. She had been raised in the harsh borderlands, taught that power was always loud, always violent. Her stepfather Titus's cruelty was a heavy hand and a booming voice. She had braced herself for a king who would be a storm of teeth and claws. Instead, Orion Nightshade was the dead of winter, a silent, suffocating freeze that left her gasping for air in the vacuum of his absence. She moved toward the low table, her fingers trembling as she touched the condensation on the wine decanter. It was a vintage meant for celebration, for the mingling of blood and heat, yet it sat there as a mocking reminder of her failure to even provoke a reaction. Was she so insignificant? Or was the king's coldness a weapon he used to hollow out his enemies before he finished them? Her gaze drifted to the heavy oak doors. Beyond them lay a palace teeming with vipers like Archon, men who had been counting the seconds until the king's new bride was discarded or destroyed. If she didn't find a way to bridge the distance between her and the man who held her life in his hands, she would be more than just a sacrifice. She would be a footnote in the history of a dying dynasty. She forced herself to breathe, the scent of the lilies now cloying and sickly, as she realized the true danger wasn't the pain she had prepared for, but the terrifying possibility that she might actually want the man who had just walked out. Astraea straightened her spine, the shimmer of her golden hair catching the moonlight as she resolved that if Orion Nightshade wouldn't claim her, she would make it impossible for him to ignore her. He thought he had filed a report. She was about to show him she was the uprising he never saw coming. The door groaned on its hinges, a heavy, rhythmic sound that signaled his return. Astraea didn't turn from the window immediately. She let the tension coil in her stomach, a familiar weight she'd carried since the borderlands. Orion Nightshade didn't pace. He moved with a predatory grace that was entirely silent, stopping only when he reached the center of the room. The scent of winter air and old cedar clung to his heavy robes, cutting through the cloying sweetness of the lilies. "They are waiting," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very bones of the palace. "The Archon has placed guards at the end of the hall. He expects to see proof of a conquest by dawn." Astraea finally turned, her chin tilted upward in a mask of defiance that hid the frantic hammering of her pulse. "Then give it to him. Or am I not even worth the effort of a lie?" Orion's expression didn't soften, but his eyes darkened, a flash of something turbulent swirling in the midnight depths. He stepped toward the low table and, with a sudden, violent motion, swept the crystal decanter to the floor. The glass shattered, a frantic spray of red wine bleeding across the white marble like a fresh wound.
He didn't stop there.
He reached for the silk hangings of the bed, his large hand fistfuls of delicate fabric, and ripped them downward. The sound of tearing silk filled the silence, a jagged, raw noise that felt like a scream. "The bed must look like a battlefield," he muttered, his breath hitching as if the mere act of destruction cost him a physical price. He turned back to her, his chest heaving beneath his tunic. "They need blood, Astraea. They need to believe I broke you. If they suspect the truth, that my wolf cannot be trusted near your throat, they will remove me, and they will sell you to someone far less concerned with your survival." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them. For a moment, Astraea flinched, expecting the blow or the grasp. Instead, his fingers were surprisingly steady as he took her hand. He didn't pull her closer. He didn't claim her lips. Instead, he bowed his head, a gesture of such profound humility that it stopped the breath in her lungs. He pressed a single, lingering kiss to her knuckles. His lips were searingly hot, a stark contrast to the icy persona he wore for the court. In that fleeting contact, the Ice King vanished. She felt the tremor in his touch, a silent admission of a man drowning in a sea of his own making, terrified that his next move might be the one that finally destroyed her. When he looked up, the general was gone, replaced by a soul looking for a life raft. "Help me keep them at bay," he whispered. "And I promise, you will never have to fear me." The morning sun was a cruel intrusion, cutting through the heavy velvet curtains and illuminating the wreckage of the night before. Astraea sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the jagged tear in the silk sheets that Orion had made with his own hands. The room smelled of spilled wine and old copper, a carefully curated crime scene of a night that had been spent in whispered pacts rather than passion. When the heavy oak doors swung open, it wasn't the king who entered, but a procession of men in sterile white robes, led by the sharp-eyed Archon Voros. Voros didn't offer a greeting. He moved through the room like a carrion bird, his gaze snagging on the shattered glass and the crimson stains on the marble. Behind him, the palace physicians waited with their silver instruments, their faces devoid of empathy. They were there to verify a conquest, to ensure the king's beast had properly claimed its prize. Astraea felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air as she stood, allowing the sheer fabric of her gown to slip just enough to reveal the faint, mottled bruises she had applied to her own skin using the dregs of the wine and the pressure of her own thumbs. "The king is thorough," Voros remarked, his voice a dry rasp that made Astraea's skin crawl. He gestured for the physicians to begin their work. Orion stood by the hearth, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He looked every bit the monster the court believed him to be, dark, looming, and dangerous. But as the lead physician pulled Astraea's collar aside to inspect her neck for a claiming mark that wasn't there, Astraea caught Orion's reflection in the glass. His jaw was set so tight it looked ready to shatter, and his eyes were clouded with a visceral, raw guilt. Every lie she told, every feigned wince she offered when the physician touched her bruises, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. He was unrestrained, Astraea whispered, her voice trembling with a practiced fragility. She looked at the floor, avoiding Voros's piercing stare. "I asked him to stop, but the king does not listen to pleas." The lie hung heavy in the air, a poisonous vapor. She saw Orion's hands fist at his sides, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. To the Archon, it looked like the simmering temper of a dominant alpha. To Astraea, it was the agony of a man being forced to listen to a woman describe him as the very monster he was killing himself to avoid becoming. When Voros finally signaled the end of the inspection, satisfied by the evidence of the king's brutality, Astraea caught the briefest glimpse of Orion's face. The Ice King was cracking, and the look of self-loathing in his eyes told her that their bargain was exacting a price far heavier than any blood she could have shed. The smell of old parchment and dried lavender was a welcome escape from the suffocating tension of the royal wing. Astraea navigated the winding, subterranean stairs of the great archives, her fingers skimming the rough stone walls. Here, beneath the weight of 1,000 years of history, the air felt honest. There were no staged scenes, no spilled wine, and no Archon Voros watching her every move for a slip in her performance. She had come seeking answers to the riddle of Orion's fractured wolf, but the vastness of the library felt like a maze designed to keep its secrets buried. Looking for a way to break the ice, or just hiding from the frost? A voice drifted from behind a stack of crumbling ledgers. Astraea turned to find a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a tangled mane of dark hair, her hands stained deep indigo from mixing tinctures. This was Juno, the palace healer whose reputation for bluntness was as legendary as her knowledge of wolf physiology. She didn't bow. She merely tilted her head, assessing Astraea with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen too many queens come and go. "I'm looking for the truth," Astraea replied, her voice echoing softly against the vaulted ceiling. "The court calls him the Ice King, but I've seen the way he looks at the hearth when the fire gets too high. It isn't coldness. It's fear." Juno stepped out from the shadows, wiping her hands on a grease-stained apron. She moved with a casual grace that suggested she feared nothing in this palace of monsters. Fear is a wise emotion for a man like Orion Nightshade. Most people think he's heartless because he won't touch them. They don't realize he's holding his breath, trying to keep the monster in the basement from smelling the air. She gestured for Astraea to follow her deeper into the archives, where the light of the flickering torches struggled to reach. Juno stopped before a shelf containing a single, leather-bound volume that looked older than the palace itself. "You think you're a sacrifice because your stepfather sold you for gold, Astraea. But Orion sees himself as the executioner. He thinks his touch is a death sentence because, for the last woman who tried to love him, it was." Astraea felt a chill settle in her marrow. "Lady Mirren," she whispered, recalling a name she had heard in the hushed gossip of the kitchens. "She didn't die from a lack of love," Juno said, her voice dropping to a somber low. "She died because Orion's wolf is shattered. When a king's human side loses control of the beast, the wolf doesn't just want to claim, it wants to consume. Orion loved her with everything he was, but when the shift came, the fire he'd been suppressing turned into an inferno. He didn't break her heart. He nearly broke her body before he managed to pull himself back from the edge. She survived, but she was never the same. She fled the capital that night, leaving him with a throne he didn't want and a wolf he could no longer trust." Juno leaned in closer, the scent of bitter herbs clinging to her. "That ice you see isn't a personality trait, girl. It's a cage. It's the only thing keeping that fire from burning you to ash. He isn't rejecting you because you're cargo. He's rejecting you because he's terrified that if he lets you in, there won't be enough of you left to bury when the wolf is done." Astraea looked back toward the stairs, the image of Orion's guilt-ridden face in the mirror flashing through her mind. She realized then that their bargain wasn't just about political survival. It was a race against a clock she hadn't known was ticking. This single gesture on their wedding night wasn't just a kiss. It was a plea for mercy from a man who was starving for a connection he believed would kill her. As she left the archives, the weight of Juno's warning sat heavy in her chest, a fire of her own beginning to burn beneath the fear. She didn't just want to survive the king. She wanted to save the man within the ice. The moonlight was a jagged blade cutting through the darkness of the royal hallway as Astraea hurried toward the sound that had ripped her from sleep. It wasn't a human cry, nor was it the clean howl of a wolf. It was a visceral, grinding sound of agony, like bones snapping beneath a heavy weight. It came from the king's private study, a room she had been strictly forbidden to enter after the sun went down. She reached the heavy oak doors, and another sound followed, the frantic, desperate scratching of claws against wood, accompanied by a low, guttural whimpering that made the hair on her arms stand up. Forgetting the Archon's spies and the rules of their fragile bargain, Astraea pushed the doors open. The scent of blood and wet fur hit her immediately, thick and metallic. The study was a scene of calculated devastation. The heavy tapestries had been shredded into ribbons, hanging like flayed skin from the walls, and deep, splintering gouges marked the stonework where Orion had clearly been trying to anchor himself. In the center of the wreckage, Orion was collapsed on his hands and knees, his body shuddering with a violence that seemed to threaten to tear him apart. He was halfway through a transformation that looked like a torture session. His spine was arched unnaturally, the muscles in his back roiling like a stormy sea, and patches of thick, dark fur sprouted from skin that was mapped with fresh, self-inflicted claw marks. He had been digging his own nails into his chest and thighs, a desperate attempt to use physical pain to drive the wolf back into its cage. "Orion," she whispered, her voice trembling. He whipped his head around. His eyes were no longer the midnight blue of the general. They were a searing, fractured gold, the pupils blown wide and wild. He let out a warning snarl that vibrated through the floorboards, his upper lip curling to reveal teeth that were lengthening into fangs. "Get out," he wheezed, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. He lunged away from her, his body slamming into a heavy bookshelf with enough force to crack the wood. Astraea, run. Instead of fleeing, she took a step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the truth in the wreckage of the room. He hadn't stayed away from her because of coldness or a lack of desire. He had locked himself in this stone tomb and mutilated his own flesh to ensure he wouldn't come to her room while the beast was in control. Every scream she had heard was the sound of a man fighting a war against himself to keep her safe. "You're hurting yourself," she said, her voice steadier now, filled with a sudden, fierce clarity. "I have to," he groaned, his claws digging into the floor as another wave of transformation racked his frame. "If I don't, the wolf, it wants you." Astraea knelt on the cold floor, just out of reach of his thrashing limbs. She didn't see a monster. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes and the blood on his hands. She realized that the Ice King was a mask he wore not to keep the world out, but to keep the fire from consuming everything he touched. As the screams of the night faded into the heavy, ragged breathing of a man at his limit, Astraea reached out, her hand trembling as she waited to see if the wolf would snap or if the man would finally let her in. The stone walls of the restricted archives became their only true kingdom, a labyrinth of ink and shadow where the pretenses of the court could not follow. In the weeks that followed the Night of Screams, the library transitioned from a place of research into a sanctuary of quiet, shared breaths. While the rest of the palace whispered about the king's supposed brutality and Astraea's fragile endurance, the two of them sat huddled over ancient, vellum-bound scrolls, their shoulders nearly touching under the flickering light of a single tallow candle. Orion was different in the dark. Away from the prying eyes of Archon and the heavy weight of his crown, the jagged edges of the Ice King began to soften. He spoke in low, gravelly tones about the history of his bloodline, his fingers, still marked by the healing scabs of his self-inflicted wounds, tracing the lineage of the Nightshade kings. Astraea watched him, noticing the way his exhaustion seemed to pull at the corners of his mouth, and how he never reached for her, yet always positioned himself so his body acted as a shield between her and the drafty shadows of the room. They were looking for a cure, a ritual, or even a footnote that explained why his wolf had fractured into such a volatile, destructive force. But as they worked, the research became secondary to the domesticity of their arrangement. Astraea found herself bringing him tea steeped with the herbs Juno had recommended, and Orion, in turn, began to leave the most comfortable chair for her, draped in a heavy wolfskin cloak to keep the subterranean chill from her bones. The bargain was supposed to be a clinical transaction, a fake marriage to buy time, but the intimacy of their shared silence was becoming a weight of its own. One evening, as the rain lashed against the high, narrow windows of the archives, Orion's hand brushed against hers as they both reached for the same map of the old territories. He didn't pull away immediately. For a heartbeat, the air in the small alcove grew thick, the scent of cedar and old paper eclipsed by the sudden, sharp heat radiating from his skin. Astraea looked up, finding his midnight blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with politics or ancient curses. It was the look of a man who was starving, not for blood, but for the simple right to touch the woman he was beginning to cherish. "You should hate this place," he whispered, his voice catching on the rough edges of his restraint. "You should hate me for dragging you into this basement to hunt for ghosts. I've spent my whole life being told what I am worth in gold, Orion," Astraea replied, her voice steady despite the frantic thudding of her heart. "Here, in the dark, I'm the only one who sees you. That's worth more than the freedom you promised me." The tension between them was no longer just the fear of the wolf. It was the terrifying realization that the fake union was grounding them in a way the world outside never could. Every brush of a sleeve, every shared glance over a crumbling page, was a spark in a room full of tinder. They were playing a dangerous game, building a home inside a cage, and Astraea knew that when the ice finally finished melting, the fire that remained might be the only thing capable of saving them, or turning their sanctuary into a pyre. The heavy iron gates of the palace courtyard ground open to admit a carriage bearing the coat of arms Astraea had hoped never to see again. From the balcony, she watched as Titus stepped out, his posture draped in the practiced humility of a man who had sold his own blood to keep his glass filled. He looked smaller against the obsidian spires of the Capitol, a common vulture trying to mimic the gait of an eagle, but the oily smile he turned toward the palace windows was as sharp as a serrated blade. He hadn't come to check on his stepdaughter's well-being, he had come to collect. The confrontation happened in the solar, a room filled with the afternoon sun that felt cold the moment Titus entered.
He didn't bow to Astraea.
Instead, he paced the length of the rug, his eyes darting to the expensive tapestries with a calculation that made her skin crawl. Archon Voros stood by the hearth, a silent specter in charcoal robes, playing the role of the benevolent host. "You look well, Astraea," Titus remarked, his voice like sand in a wound. "The king's climate seems to suit you, even if the rumors suggest he prefers his books to his bride." Astraea stood her ground, her hands folded tightly to hide the tremor in her fingers. "The king's preferences are a private matter, Titus. Why are you here?" Titus glanced at Voros before leaning in, the scent of stale ale and cheap tobacco clinging to him. "I'm here because your debts weren't settled as cleanly as you think. The Archon tells me the king has been distant. He tells me the throne is unstable. If the Nightshade line fails, those who stood by the Alpha King will find themselves in a very deep, dark hole." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, but Astraea recoiled. "He offers a way out. Give us the truth of his condition. Tell us why he hides in the dark, and your mother's remaining debts vanish. You get your freedom now, not in 2 months. You can leave this den of wolves behind." The choice was a jagged line cut through her heart. In one hand was the freedom she had craved since she was a child, the chance to disappear with her mother and never look over her shoulder again. In the other was a king who had spent his nights mutilating his own flesh to ensure she remained whole. Orion had rejected her wedding bed, but he had offered her the only thing that mattered in this palace, the truth of his own suffering. "He is a monster, Astraea," Titus hissed, his eyes gleaming with greed. "Don't let a few soft words and a kiss on the hand fool you. He will break you eventually. Why protect a man who won't even look you in the eye?" Astraea looked past her stepfather to the Archon, who was watching her with the patient hunger of a predator. She realized then that she wasn't choosing between a debt and a king. She was choosing between being a piece of cargo and being a person. If she betrayed Orion, she would be proving Titus right, that she was nothing more than a transaction to be completed. "The king has given me more respect in his silence than you ever gave me in 20 years of speaking," Astraea said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "I have no secrets to give you, Titus. And if you ever speak of my mother again, I will ensure the king's ice is the least of your concerns." Titus's face contorted into a mask of rage, but the Archon merely smiled, a cold, thin line. As they were escorted out, Astraea leaned against the stone wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had chosen the wolf. She had chosen the man who hid in the dark. And as she looked toward the restricted archives, she knew there was no going back to the girl she used to be. The bargain was dead. The war had begun. The heat in the restricted archives was no longer coming from the flickering braziers, but from the unbearable proximity of their bodies. They were leaning over a map of the northern wilds, the ink faded but the air between them electric. Astraea could smell the scent of wood smoke and something primal clinging to Orion's skin, a musk that made her heart race with a rhythm that wasn't fear. When her hand slipped against the parchment, Orion caught her wrist to steady her. His skin was fever-hot, his grip firm yet trembling with a restraint that seemed to be fraying by the second. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between their lips. Orion's gaze dropped to her mouth, his pupils dilating until his eyes were vast pools of midnight. Astraea didn't pull away. She leaned in, her fingers finding the heavy embroidery of his tunic. She wanted to bridge the distance, to prove that he didn't have to fight his nature alone. But as her breath hitched against his jaw, a low, Tectonic rumble began deep in his chest, a sound that wasn't human. The air turned predatory. Orion's muscles coiled like a spring, and a flash of jagged, liquid gold eclipsed the blue of his eyes. Before Astraea could even gasp, he shoved her away. The force was sudden and jarring, sending her stumbling back against a bookshelf with a thud that echoed through the silent vault. "Don't," he roared, the word mangled by a growing snarl. He turned his back to her, his hands gripping the edge of the stone table so hard the rock began to hairline fracture under his claws. "Do you have any idea how close I just came to ending you? You play with fire as if you cannot be burned. Astraea, I was trying to help you," she cried, the sting of the rejection sharper than the impact against the shelves. "I don't need your help. I need you to stay away." He didn't look at her, but the sheer coldness in his voice was a physical barrier. "You are a guest in this cage, nothing more. Do not mistake my silence for a welcome." The rift opened then, wider and deeper than any political divide. Astraea stood in the shadows, watching the man she had begun to trust retreat behind a wall of ice so thick she feared nothing would ever melt it again. She left the archives without a word, the heat of the moment replaced by a frost that settled deep in her bones. The silence in the palace had curdled into something sharp and expectant. Archon had not waited for the morning to strike. Instead, he arrived with a contingent of the High Council at midnight, their torches casting flickering, skeletal shadows against the stones of the Great Hall. The decree was read with a clinical finality. The lack of a visible blood bond had been deemed a failure of the royal lineage. They had 24 hours to prove the marriage had been sealed by a primal union, or Orion would be stripped of his crown and both would face execution for treason against the pack. Astraea found Orion in the restricted archives, not hunched over books, but standing in the center of the room as if waiting for a blow to fall. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of his rising agitation. When he turned to her, his face was a mask of raw, unfiltered agony. The wall of ice hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated. "I cannot do it," he whispered, his voice a jagged edge of despair. He moved toward her, his footsteps heavy. "The Archon knows. He moved the deadline because he knows that the more I care for you, the more the wolf tries to tear its way out to claim you. It doesn't understand restraint, Astraea. It only understands hunger." He stopped inches from her, his heat radiating off him in waves that made the air tremble. "I spent my life thinking the cold was my curse. But it was my only defense. Because the truth is, I am falling for you. And that love is the very thing that makes the wolf a murderer. Every time I look at you, the beast sees a mate it must possess at any cost, even if that cost is your life." Astraea reached out, her fingers grazing his trembling jaw. "Then let it," she said, her voice a low, fierce vow. "We have 24 hours to be more than a bargain. If we are to die, let us die reaching for each other rather than shivering in the dark." Orion's eyes flooded with a terrifying, molten gold. The confession hadn't brought peace. It had signaled the start of the final storm. He let out a low, broken groan, his forehead dropping against hers as he fought the internal war one last time. The deadline was a ghost at their backs, and the man and the beast were finally, dangerously one. The ritual chamber was a hollow of ancient stone, illuminated by a circle of white-hot braziers that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a dying star. Outside, the heavy thrum of the High Council's presence was a physical weight, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the terrifying, musky heat of the transformation. Orion was barely a man anymore. His body was a distorted map of shifting muscle and shadow, his teeth lengthening into ivory daggers as the fractured wolf clawed its way to the surface. Archon stood at the edge of the circle, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a man about to watch a kingdom fall. "Complete the bond, king," he sneered, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "Or let the girl run and admit you are a failure to your blood." Orion let out a guttural, bone-shaking roar, his claws gouging the stone floor as the golden fire in his eyes threatened to consume his last shred of humanity. He lunged toward Astraea, not with the grace of a lover, but with the desperate, jagged hunger of a starving beast. Astraea didn't move. She didn't flinch as the massive shadow loomed over her, the heat of his breath searing her skin. She reached out, her fingers pale against the dark, roiling fur beginning to sprout along his jaw. "I am not running," she whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the center of the storm. As her palm touched his skin, the expected violence didn't come. Instead, a shock of pure, unfiltered connection surged through her. She felt the wolf's terror, not a desire to destroy, but a frantic, ancient need to protect the only light it had ever known in the dark. The beast wasn't a monster. It was a guardian that had been screaming in a cage because it didn't know how to love without hurting. Astraea pulled the massive head toward her, pressing her forehead against his. The gold in his eyes softened, the jagged edges of his transformation smoothing out as the Ice King finally shattered. The frost that had guarded his heart for a decade melted into a flood of raw, overwhelming heat. Orion's human hands found her waist, pulling her into the center of the flame. The bond snapped into place, a blinding flare of silver light that threw Voros back into the shadows. The ritual was complete. Orion stood tall, his wolf finally silent and whole within him, his eyes clear and midnight blue as he turned to face the stunned council. The bargain was over. The king had found his queen, and the ice was gone forever.